Yeah, well, we Catholics, we always believe that the Holy Spirit's involved in giving us the Pope. So we know that it will take us in the right direction.
You met the Pope, the late Pope Francis, when he was visiting New York.
Yeah, it was an interesting story, John. I nearly didn't meet him because the first couple of emails I got the 2 weeks before he arrived, I assumed were a fishing expedition. Urgent, urgent meeting with Pope. I'm going like, come on. I mean, this is really cheap. But eventually, my secretary sorted it all out. It was real. I think he wanted to meet some Wall Street Catholics. And so, we were graced to have that opportunity to meet him for about an hour before he went to speak at the UN. We were up at the nuncio's residence up there on the Upper East Side where he was staying. And my goodness, I don't know. Of course, I'd seen the popes from afar and gone to the visitations in the Vatican, that kind of stuff, but never been in the presence of the Pope, like that. And it was just, I don't know, something about it that just leaves you floating.
Mm.
And he's such a humble man, or was such a humble man. I had all this preset things I was going to say to him, but very quickly I started referring to him as father,
Mm.
uh, which my wife later, as we debriefed, was horrified that I used the proper, but he never flinched, and I wanted to give him. I think you may know that we do a spiritual tour of the Metropolitan Museum. Um, 4 or 5 times a year on Friday nights. It's a big deal. It takes about 3.5 hours. It's a pilgrimage to the search for God through art, basically. It became a book called Pilgrimage to the Museum, which in some ways is the prequel to Visions of the Divine, because in the process of doing pilgrimage and looking for God through art, it finally occurred to us that the place you find God is in the Mass. I mean, this seems obvious, maybe, but and that the art is inextricably linked to that. In fact, most Catholic art was created to help the laity and the clergy enter into the mystery of the Eucharist. And so, in the process of doing pilgrimage, it led us to this book, which it's hard for me to believe no one has ever thought to do this. But basically, it reunites the art of the Mass, which after the Reformation was ripped out of the churches and sent off to museums. And it reunites it with the Mass liturgy itself, prayer by prayer. It's like a visual prayer book for the Mass with these beautiful reflections written in deep prayer that made me cry when I write it. My editor at Sophia, she's crying. I mean, it's kind of very moving. But I just interrupted myself like 3 times. So let me get the train of thought. We're trying to talk about the Pope, right? And there's this image. There's a chapter in Visions of the Divine called "Preparing to See God." So it's
And
like,
Visions of the Divine, I'm going to interrupt you here, Steve, is your latest tome. I finished reading it and it's wonderful. And we're going to get into that, but continue your thought.
yeah. So there's this section, chapter before the Mass starts called "Preparing to See God." And of course, one of the things you do to prepare to see God is go to the sacrament of reconciliation so that you can enter the Eucharist in a state of grace. So for that image, we use the Penitent Magdalene, which is one of the two paintings we gave to the Pope.
Mm.
The other one is a painting by Velasquez that hangs at the Metropolitan Museum, um, of a slave painted as a pope,
Mm.
which transformed the artist who painted it.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's a long story, so I probably won't go through it here, but That's called Juan de Pareja. But the Penitent Magdalene is this wonderful image that we use at the beginning of Visions, not quite at the beginning, but in that section about the Sacrament of Reconciliation. And it shows, it's a very mysterious painting. At any given night, you'll see a crowd of people gathered around this thing. It's very still, it's dark, a woman alone in the dark. It's the Magdalene, and she's just come back from her first encounter with Christ. She's still dressed as a prostitute. In those days, they believed she was a prostitute. Okay, so without getting into that debate, but um, and she's come back. She's kind of disheveled. She's thrown the tools of her trade aside, the jewels. You can see her necklace on the floor. Her earrings are on the dresser, and she's contemplating what's happened to her. And she's holding in her lap a human skull, which is at that time used as an image of our mortality. But she's not in a panic anymore about it. She's thinking about it peacefully. She's calm. And then she's thinking about the journey ahead, which she knows is going to be filled with crosses and not going to be easy. And those jewels are still in arm's length away over there on the dresser. Like, isn't that the case? Even when we have a kind of very good confession, you know, those sinful habits are still there. It's not that easy.
So
And
you go ahead, Steve.
yeah, she's thinking about that. She turns to the mirror, her source of comfort, and instead of seeing herself, she sees Christ in the form of a candle lit that's lighting the darkness, the light of grace, a vision of the divine, if you will. And he just says to her, Mary, um, John 21, I guess, right? Very
That's
beautiful.
that's remarkable. So you give these pieces to the Pope, and I'm sure he gratefully received them. I want to pick up on that, and then move on to visions of the divine and art pieces in church history and where we're at today. Why, in some people's opinion, there's less art in the church. Modern churches are not as alluring as older buildings, less of a sense of the divine, which is not a knock on them, but it seems to be a fact. Um, what was your take on the Pope? You're a Catholic businessman, a Wall Street executive, holding a very senior position. Um, some people have said he's anti-capitalist. Um, I know we could go down a rabbit hole on that, but I'm just curious. The church isn't anti-free enterprise, but maybe free enterprise and capitalism are two separate things.
Well, I mean, the Pope is still a man, and and we're always defined by our context. That's why, the powerful thing about visions is I try to put the art in the context of the time and the mass in which it was formed, right? But understanding the context is very important, I think, to understanding anyone. And Pope Francis grew up in Argentina. It was a kind of corrupt form of capitalism there. I think it may have given him some bad impressions, if you
Hmm.
will. And capitalism has its rough edges, but
Hmm.
the Lord calls on us to smooth out those rough edges with Christianity. And I don't know that the Pope. I mean, you're right. It's a rabbit hole, and I don't know what was in his mind sometimes. But he was our father, and I all that was like forgotten in this moment in front of the Pope. I just started calling him father, and I came out of the meeting, and my assistant in her typical fashion, has the schedule worked out: 7:30 meeting with Pope, 8:15 investment meeting in London, 9 o'clock, da da da, 10 o'clock, and I get out, I come stumbling out of this meeting. And I call her up and I go, Mary, like, cancel the day. I can't focus right now.
Mm. Mm.
I just met the Pope. I mean, and whenever you think about his political views and everything else, he's the Pope, and Christ's light shone through him in his face in the very gentle and humble way he interacted with us.
hmm
Um, it, you know,
Had a profound impact on you, and that's an interesting recollection. I want to talk about art and church history and the divine in art. Obviously, back in medieval times and up to even the early 1800s, photography hadn't been invented, and the kind of ways we capture images permanently today just was not around. So we relied clearly on artists to interpret great works of the divine and worship and so on. Um, my wife and I were recently in Bermuda, and as an Irishman, there were two things that I observed. It's kind of like a paradise, but it's still a British occupied territory. But we will
no,
let that one go.
they have a couple of Catholic churches there, though.
They actually do. They
Yeah,
have. We staked that one out,
yeah,
and the cathedral, the I guess Protestant or Anglican cathedral, is, I believe, the tallest building in Hamilton.
yeah.
But if you go to the parish of St. George, there's a beautiful Anglican church, St. Peter's, up on a hill, and it's both a working church where services are held and where tourists go to. It's just remarkable pieces of art. The point I'm making is back then in the 16, 1700s, they gave such loving treatment to the building of churches. It could have taken two generations, but it was done with such affection. Today, it seems to be a bit more utilitarian. One interesting thing about that Anglican church, which was up in the hill, it's painted white and so on. It has a tabernacle,
Mm.
in one corner, which I wasn't aware until I did my research that the higher Protestant churches, the Anglicans, are very close, but obviously separated from the Catholic way of we do things. Um, and then they had the Ten Commandments listed. So, how do you see that, Steve? We have less emphasis today on beautiful works of art, or am I missing something? We don't know who these are. Are the artists hiding from sight, or church authorities don't want to kind of promote these art pieces?
Well, my read, John, is that what happened was after the Reformation, the early, especially Calvin, was very much opposed to art as a form of idolatry.
Nah.
And it even infected the church itself, the iconoclasts. And that kind of caused the art to be pulled out of. I mean, if you study it and visions, we go all the way back to the catacombs, because from the very beginnings, the church used art as a way of entering into the mystery. Art touches the soul. It's not just cartoons, but
hmm
there's a great image in visions of the Ghent altarpiece, and Evelyn and I go down to Ghent at this very dramatic moment in the Mass where the priest holds up the Eucharist, behold the Lamb of God. And this altarpiece was created for St. Pablo's Cathedral, really for that moment. And starting with the Reformation, the Ghent altarpiece was under attack. The iconoclasts tried to burn it, actually. And the monks in charge of St. Pablo's at the time, in the kind of, very violent period right after the Reformation, they saved it at the last moment by pulling it up on pulleys up into the belfry tower and hiding it up there. The altarpiece was stolen 11 times in its history. It
My
was
goodness.
sawed in half. It was nearly blown up by Hitler in the salt caves. The monument men saved it. By some miracle, the Ghent altarpiece has survived. and is today back where it belongs at St. Pablo's Cathedral in Ghent. But yeah, John, I think there was a kind of there's a creeping modernism that came in, maybe theologically from, I don't want to blame the Protestants for it, but somehow or other, kind of from that angle. And even, I could cry some days when I'm in the Met and I see a priest giving a tour of the Met. And I think, oh goodness, finally. But even Catholic tour guides, I experienced this also, frankly, at the Vatican. I'll tell you a story about that in a second. Um, feel like they've got to outdo the secular art historians with their knowledge of all the secular elements of the painting, the background, the brushwork. Now, look, I was trained in art history at Princeton University, so I get all that. But the art is so much more than that. And I want to say, Father, they're here for a reason, Go deep. Go into it. Don't feel like you've got to convince everybody that you know your stuff on the art history stuff. It's art is so much deeper. Evelyn and I gave a presentation at the Vatican Museum about a year ago. And we got a call from the Vatican. This time, of course, our antennas are up because, like, after the last time with the Pope, my secretary picks up the phone. It's like, hey, the Vatican is calling Steve. You're on line one. Yes, sister. How are you? Good to meet you. And yeah, she asked the head of the Vatican Museum, asked us to come over. Well, she actually, maybe I shouldn't go into too much detail about it, but really the purpose was we found ourselves giving a presentation to the assembled docents of the Vatican Museum about pilgrimage to museum, and in a way about visions of the divine, and helping them think about how you can use the art and put it back in its context, and don't be afraid. Christ said many times, be not afraid. And Sister kept telling the docents, if these two people can do this in New York City, for goodness sakes, you can go a little deeper here. Isn't that why people come to the Vatican Museum? I guess. I don't know. A lot of people come just because they're told they should go there.
Yeah, it's like a tourist on your
Checking it off
to-do list, checking off the
that's the
box.
challenge, for the docents. I get that.
Steve, you've written about how you were raised from the spiritual ashbin of agnosticism, and you were raised Catholic, and then you fell away. You came back to it after recovering from a very serious health issue, a heart attack, the intervention by a Catholic priest, a good confession, and now you actually take to the streets of New York City, helping souls come back to the faith. You're one of your previous tomes was Missionary of Wall Street, but as you say in your latest book, Visions of the Divine, it never occurred to you previously that art and the Eucharist are deeply connected. And in fact, the book, I suppose, takes us through the Mass, right? Through these pieces of art you describe. And it was a long journey because geographically you covered a lot of territory with your wife, Evelyn, and you had some co-travelers.
Yeah. Yeah, it had it. I know this may sound like, well, when I read a book by this guy, he didn't even know this, but I don't know. It just hadn't occurred to me that all of this great art that I love in all these museums was created really to help enter into the mystery of the Eucharist. And either was in the churches or was devotional pieces that were designed for people at chapels in their homes and everything else. But once you started putting the jigsaw puzzle together, and we visit 20 different cities to do this, and of course we had the Mass itself we were cheating in a way because we had the structure of the Mass as the frame in which to, when you put it together a jigsaw puzzle, you have a picture on the cover of the box, the same kind of thing. We kind of knew where we were trying to head. But as we gradually put the pieces together and saw the different pieces in the context of roughly where they would have been within the Mass, the art came alive in a way. It was always alive, but it just came so much richer. So what's interesting about the book, John, is that art lovers, I think, will love it. And I know will love it because I have several of them written reviews about it. Because it helps them see the art much more richly within the context for which it was created. But everyday Catholics will absolutely cherish it because it becomes, and it was written by a broken vessel. Like, I'm not a saint or anything. And so I have all the flaws that some Catholics have. The mind wanders in church.
Mm-hmm.
Priest is talking too long. The prayers keep getting mixed up. It took me a while to figure this out. When studying the Mass so carefully to write the book, I had to realize, these different prayers are changing every day, and some do, some don't. And we sort all that out in the book. And what it does is it helps me do, and I think it's helping others do, is it gives you visuals to help enter into that prayer and stay focused. We have a chapter in the book called Reflections After Communion. Now, that's always a dangerous time for me because Mass is over. I've had the communion. Now I'm like thinking about, the 7:30 meeting, whatever it is Mary's got on the schedule. And, that's such an important time, actually, that moment we have alone with the Lord after communion. So we have 7 images and reflections that I use a lot now. I just pull them up in my head, focus on one that day, but can really help enter into what just happened. The whole book's like that. It's like a visual prayer guide for the Mass.
You have some very interesting sections on very well-known painters and might surprise some readers. Vincent van Gogh, your wife, Evelyn, and yourself visited the psychiatric asylum in France, southern France, to visit the small countryside hospital where Vincent spent nearly a year trying to recover from a debilitating depression. And some of his art reflects the divine.
Yeah, people don't realize necessarily because Van Gogh has become probably the most popular artist, which is ironic. I guess he never sold a painting when he was alive. No one cared stuff. He started out life as a Methodist minister, actually, and was a devout believer. But it didn't work out. He had trouble with relationships, as I think most people know. And I think he had trouble with his relationship with God, even. And so he didn't really work out too well as a pastor. I think he, frankly, was fired. I'm not really sure. But you get the sense that that's what happened. And he writes a letter to his brother that he's going to try to find God through art. So if you start interpreting Van Gogh that way, you can see a lot of his art as a struggle to find God. Starry, Starry Night. I was just with a priest this weekend here in New York. He had never seen it. I said, Father, we got to go see this painting. In this nightmarish, I mean, people view it in different ways as look up at the night sky, but in the cypress tree, which represents eternity in the painting, and the wheat field, which is the final harvest. And for Van Gogh, I think God was kind of a scary thing a little bit, In Visions, we have 2 of his paintings. One is during the Liturgy of the Word, which was a difficult section of the book for us to write because I didn't want to have just one gospel story. which one, And so we ended up with an archetype of all the stories. Like the Old Testament, we have 3 stories about salvation history. The New Testament, we have a story from Acts, the early church. We have one of the great letters of St. Paul. And in the Gospels, we have a miracle, we have a calling story. We were talking before about St. Matthew, calling St. Matthew. We have a miracle, we have a parable, we have a story from the Passion, etc. So for the parable story, we use the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is a great story about love. And I think, your listeners know that story well, but they probably don't know that Van Gogh painted a masterpiece on the Good Samaritan, which is in a small museum, the Kroller Museum in Eastern Netherlands. So, we took a long car ride to get there. And it's an amazing painting. It was painted while he was at Saint-Rémy. His brother, he was confined to quarters. He couldn't go outside. So his brother sent him prints of other great masters, and he used the print to make his own interpretation. This is from a Delacroix print. But I love the energy of the painting as it kind of vibrates with the intensity of this moment.
Mm-hmm.
And Van Gogh imagines, you can see in the shimmering light, the 2 Jewish priests walking off in the distance, and then the Samaritan, sworn enemy of the Jew. And the 2 become one flesh as the Samaritan tries to lift him up in his superhuman effort to put him onto his horse. And this is something that was unheard of at the time, that, you'd even touch a Samaritan. But Van Gogh imagines this love between the 2, which is the love of Christ, And I thought it was very beautiful. There's another Van Gogh in the reflections after communion. It's a Pietà, and it's Mary along with Jesus, the sacrifice of the Lamb, the Eucharist. She's holding him in her lap, and she's reflecting on his sacrifice and hers. And then as you look more carefully, you see that the image of Christ is a self-portrait of him.
Wow, that's striking.
And he's imagining becoming Christ. And when we consume the Eucharist, actually the Eucharist consumes us. Christ consumes us. We become more like him. And Van Gogh's imagining that, I think, at that moment.
Your pieces that you write about are not exclusively Catholic artists, because Van Gogh was obviously Methodist or Protestant, but they touch upon the divine and our Christian tradition. Another interesting one that got my attention was Pablo Picasso of the Cubist movement, or co-founder, let's say, presumably raised Catholic, but you never would have tied him to Catholic art pieces, because there's this one extraordinary one he wrote of a First Communion. Was it his sister or sibling? And she's facing the altar.
Yeah.
But of course, I'm sure they were rare pieces and representations by Pablo, because we just don't associate him with the divine as such.
Yeah, I mean, most people assume that Picasso was an atheist. Certainly, who knows what's in someone's heart, but the evidence would suggest possibly he was, for sure. And he invents, in the Demoiselles d'Avignon, where he invents Cubism, that's the famous moment, in my mind at least, where the artist finally does something very ungodlike, which is he takes God's creations, chops them up, and puts them back together again, and becomes the creator. So that's the moment of our modern culture, the first painting where a painter does that. And that, of course, leads to abstract expressionism and all the intellectualism of art today. And in some ways, Picasso does that and starts it. That's in 1907. Now, when Picasso does that, people don't realize it was actually inspired by El Greco's famous painting, The Opening of the Fifth Seal, which wasn't famous at the time. Picasso had found it in a dusty art gallery and his friend bought it, and they put it in their living room. That was in 1903. And at that time, Picasso was still painting realistic images. And he takes The Opening of the Fifth Seal and converts an image of divine love into an image of profane love, the prostitutes of Avignon. And in the so doing, cuts up God's creations and recreates them as the creator. So I think your instinct is right, John, that you wouldn't necessarily go to Picasso for inspiration on finding God. And so we were stunned. And all that's explained, by the way, in my earlier book, Pilgrimage to the Museum. But we were down in Barcelona. Actually, we went down there to see the Sagrada Familia, which, if you haven't seen, is just unbelievable. But we also wanted to go to the Picasso Museum down there. And we were stunned to see this image painted when he was 15 years old. It's completely realistic, as you pointed out, of his younger sister receiving First Holy Communion. And we use that image, actually also in that chapter on Reflections After Communion, we talk about, and it's so serious, and Picasso's father was a strict Catholic.
Mm.
And I wonder whether, I don't know what happened, but I feel like there was a kind of rebellion kind of thing that happened. It happens to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
But at that time, he's 15 years old, and he paints this wonderful image of his sister, beautiful, in her white gown, so serious, so focused as she receives Holy Communion for the first time. And we use that as one of the reflections after communion also, or keep coming back to that chapter, which is kind of an important one, I guess. But that, think about the first time you received Holy Communion. Think of how focused you were and how important it was to you. And sometimes when I receive Holy Communion these days, I don't, I kind of take it for granted a little bit, and maybe my mind is floating. And that's an image to help us think about that, like maybe bring yourself back to that moment. And Picasso's painting definitely does that. What's interesting, John, is that for all his meanderings and mistresses and wives and the whole story, and the way he makes himself the creator,
Mm-hmm.
He had that pain with him when he died.
Of his sister?
Yeah.
What, he
One
had
of
it
the few
in his
paintings
bedside in his bedroom?
he carried it around with him. We were at different locations. And I pray on that. I hope to myself.
Interesting.
That's why I never try to figure out what's in someone's heart,
That's
It's kind of nice that he had that.
yeah. It's certainly well, you talk about the Eucharist and the mystery of the Eucharist. That it's who can fully understand that, obviously, but if we believe the polling, the majority of Catholics don't believe, it's the body of Christ.
Yeah.
So my question then is that why we have no Catholics as a group are not in awe as much anymore of the divine, and why we don't see it manifested in great art pieces?
Well, I don't know. Maybe one leads the other.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Maybe one leads the other, John,
Mm-hmm.
and they affect each other. That's what we're trying to do at Visions, is bring back these images of the Lamb of God and the mystery um, that people had back in the day, that it wasn't catechesis. It was just the beauty of the mystery, that touched their soul. There's an image. We use this during the Eucharistic liturgy by Pontormo. And it's in a small church in Florence on the other side of the Arno called San Felicita. And most people don't even know about this painting, or certainly don't know about Santa Felicita. But we were over in Florence, studying. Obviously had to make several trips to Florence. There's a lot of Eucharistic art there. But I got a text from Donnie McManus. I don't know if you know Donnie, but
From Dublin?
Sorry?
He's from Ireland, Donny?
He is, Donnie McManus.
Yeah, I
So
remember you
know him.
refer to him. Well, you refer to him in the book, and I was very proud that you give us a shout out.
Yeah, no, he's this very devout. You should have him on your podcast someday.
Mm, mm, mm.
He's a very devout Catholic artist who, like the Byzantine artists, really, prays first deeply before he starts his work. Sort of the way Visions is written in some
Mhm.
ways, was written in prayer. And Donnie and I really clicked over Pilgrimage to the Museum. I didn't know him at all, but he spent the weekend in New York with the book and going through the Met. And he's sending me texts, Steve, you're inside my head here. This is exactly. And anyway, we became friends. And when he heard I was in Florence, he said, Steve, go see Pontormo's deposition from the cross. It's life-changing. And we did. We hurried over there. And it becomes a very important painting in Visions of the Divine. We use it at the moment after the recitation of the Mystery of Faith, which itself is spectacular. These three images that we use for that. And then the priest offers the prayer, we offer you this holy and living sacrifice before the altar. And Pontormo paints in 1527. So Rome has just been sacked. Some of your listeners may not realize the worst sack of Rome ever was actually by a Lutheran army in 1527.
Mm-hmm.
It's a long story, and it's
Mm-hmm.
not a good period for either the Protestants or the Catholics. But in any case, the Renaissance ends spectacularly at that point, of course. And they're searching for a new form of art. And Pontormo comes along and paints this image, which was panned at the time by all the locals, including Vasari, who's very famous at that time, because it has all these psychedelic colors. And think El Greco. It's like an early El Greco. Pontormo is sort of his predecessor in some ways. The souls of these images are painted on the outside, the body's on the inside. They kind of float, and the passion and mystery. I mean, the Pietà normally at that up till then was always painted as a very tight, still composition. Think of, for instance, Michelangelo's Pietà, which I think most people can call that image in their minds. Mary and Christ together, compacted at the center, tightly bound, Mary contemplating quietly the mystery of what's happened. Okay, it's very beautiful. But in Pontormo's version, her arms are flying out as she screams, maybe in agony, or she's crying in grief. And she lets Christ fall off her lap onto the back of John, the church. And he's kind of floating down the back of John in all these kind of psychedelic colors. And what's going on here? In the center of the painting, and this is what made the Renaissance viewers nuts, is there's a void. Like usually the center is where in the Renaissance, the eye is focused. The mathematical perspective draws you to the center. In this case, there's nothing in the center because Christ is kind of floated past the center. Mary's falling backwards. Christ is falling forwards, and there's nothing in the center. And so what's going on here? So we go over there, and the first thing I notice is that the painting is exactly where it was meant to be when it was painted, which is unusual these days. And it's painted above the altar in this chapel. Christ is floating down the back of John onto the altar, the Eucharistic sacrifice, this holy and living sacrifice. He's alive because he's eternal. And then when you kneel down and imagine a priest, and it's surprising me no one has ever pointed this out, but maybe because you've got to come at it from the angle of a liturgical participant,
Mhm.
not an art historian. When you kneel down at the altar and imagine the priest holding up the Eucharist, behold the Lamb of God,
Mhm.
the Eucharist fills the void in the painting. The Eucharist fills the void in our lives, in the lives of the disciples,
Mhm.
as Christ, ascends to heaven, but leaves us the Eucharist.
Wow. Steve, you traveled widely researching this book with your wife, Evelyn. You've been married over 40 years, I believe, and you're very close bond, and she's a devout Catholic like yourself. So you went, a lot of your travels were through Europe. Um, did it remind you when you went to France, Rome, and all other countries how strongly rooted in Christian traditions these countries are? You know, they came up out of the faith, really. And so you see all these remarkable buildings, Notre Dame and other cathedrals and little churches. France is populated with churches, but many of them today, unfortunately, are regarded as tourist attractions for the many people who visit Europe. So the roots aren't so strong anymore. We've moved away from that, but people need to be reminded that Europe, is rooted in Christianity. That's what helps explain some of the cohesion and the civil order and maybe even the prosperity that followed, through the centuries in Europe.
Yeah, and a lot of, as you mentioned, in fact, literally, especially when you go to Germany, the churches have been turned into museums.
Mm.
We were talking to a priest over there because in another one of our projects, Evelyn's involved with Catholic World Mission. And one of the projects that Catholic World Mission is funding is building a church in Vienna. And we were over to Vienna because we went to see one of the most famous paintings that most Catholics listening to the show would know is the Fall of the Rebel Angels by Giordano,
Mhm.
which most of us know as a little tiny prayer card. And so I was kind of imagining a small, and we walk into the Vienna Museum, and this painting dominates the wall. It's like 12 feet high. St. Michael effortlessly dispensing with these rebel angels. And as they fall into hell, you see them turning from angels into devils. It's an amazing painting. But anyway, we were there to see the fall of the rebel angels and met with Father, who's building this church that's being funded in this other project we're involved with, Catholic World Mission. And he was telling us, Steve, I go, Father, what are you doing building a church here? And there's like churches everywhere.
Yeah.
And he said, well, they are, but the thing is, because the state owns the churches and kind of collects the taxes from
Hmm.
the laity, and then they pay it to the state actually dictates what you can and cannot do. And among other things, and it was a cold winter day, he goes, you can't turn the heat on in the churches. So no one wants to stay in the churches because they're cold.
Mm.
So, we're building our own church without the state's support. And, he's got a little cafe in the front. The young people love that. And yeah, he said that in Vienna, I don't know, something like 1% of the laity are still, you know, practicing.
Wow,
It's
that is
really
tiny.
tough, you know?
Do you think where do you see the future of the Catholic Church in Western Europe as separate from Africa and those other nations where it seems to be really growing? Is it at a turning point? Is it status quo in decline? Where is it going?
Well, okay. I mean, you know better than I.
Mm,
Uh, and we didn't talk much about Ireland, but I
mm,
very closely connected with Ireland. I have a very close friend from business school who
mm,
lives there, so I get there almost every year,
mm,
and have watched over the last 40 years the secularization of Ireland.
mm.
Um, I've been talking to folks out there about starting a street mission in Dublin,
Okay.
like the one we do in Soho, to try to bring people back. So at one level, you could get really dark here and see this decline that seems inexorable. Um, but I don't know. I'm the eternal optimist. I
Yeah.
always tell people, look, God doesn't lose. I mean,
Yeah. Yeah.
he is
Yeah.
God.
Well,
And
we got through the Reformation and we had upheavals and we had
yeah,
declines and revivals.
yeah. And one of the things that's something new, and I felt it last week we were down in Soho with our missionaries, reaching out to people in this very affluent neighborhood. And my last blog post on it, which is in my website, missionaryofwallstreet.com, you can see the blog posts. They're beautiful.
Mm,
It's all stories that I write that happen. But the blog post was called Out in the Love Fest. And
mm,
we really felt the love in the neighborhood. Not the rejection you'd expect, but rather something is turning, something is in the air. There's a lot of young people coming to the faith now.
mm-hmm.
They're seeking God. And if you were a missionary on the streets of New York, you would know why.
Mm,
All this happiness that people are pursuing in the secular world, it's all turning out not to be very happy.
mm-hmm.
And it's leaving them very empty and in despair. And of course, the light of the faith, Jesus and the Eucharist, is the answer to that. That's why he's there to fill the void in our lives, as Pontormo understood. And I really do think that that's what's happening. And maybe not completely in our lifetime. You know, we're just tools in this grand plan. We do our little part. Um, but I really firmly believe that um, things are changing for the better.
Well, I hope you're right. I tend to agree with you. There's so many positives out there. It is encouraging. You meet young people and you've been down on the streets of Soho. That's got to be just a really interesting encounter with some of the population of all kinds. But to succeed there, Steve, I haven't seen you in action. You got to be authentic as you are. You got to have all the answers. You got to have great faith. Um, you got to be genuine. You've got to be loving, non-judgmental. You can't be stern. And people will listen, I presume, if you have those characteristics.
John, I that you could give the pep talk I give to the missionaries. My wife tries to give them all the techniques and things. She's very nurturing and says, if they say this to them, and they'll tell you this, you should get. But in the end of the day, I tell the missionaries, look, love and joy. That's all you need. It conquered an empire. The joy of the Christian isn't happiness, it is confidence in the future that gives us happiness, even when it's in the outside world. Why is that guy smiling? And love is genuine, it comes from the heart. People feel that love and they want some of it. There's a story, we're going back.
So, Steve, let me stop you there. So, a great absence of love in our modern culture.
Yeah.
I mean, I think that's correct. You know, families and middle class Americans and poor Americans, all kinds, rich Americans. There is many of them are not fulfilled. The ones who haven't discovered something, that you have discovered and that you
Yeah, or they
share in.
want to, yet they try to love, even Catholics try to love using what I call the white knuckle method,
Mm,
which is my preferred method as a type AAA,
mm,
in case your listeners haven't figured that out yet. But, um, just grit your way through it, persevere, you can do it. And what happens is you can do it. I mean, if you're really tough, like I think I am, and others are, but you lose your love. We have an image in Visions of the Divine. This is in the New Testament reading section, and we're reflecting on one of Paul's letters. We only have one letter, we're trying to sample. So 1 Corinthians 13, um, love is patient, love is kind, uh, and and we have an image of something called charity. So one of the problems with the English language, and God bless us, we have more words than anybody,
mm-hmm,
but we only have one word for love. We have love. Like, whereas the Greeks have filial, which means friendship. They have eros, which means, sensual or sexual love. And they have agape, which means all giving love, which is the love of Christ. And that's the love that we have on the streets. And caritas, which has been kind of transmitted into by a lot of Catholics into just the kind of charity, the sense of helping the poor and stuff, which is an important part of our faith. But caritas is so much more than that. And we have an image of caritas. It's in the National Gallery in London, of a young mother trying to deal with three little babies at once.
mm,
One's nursing, one's trying to nap, one's up and wants to be entertained. And she's trying to deal with them all and giving everything she has, but she's running out of gas and she's getting a little frantic. And then she looks up to God, to Jesus, and you can see her eyes tearing up and an opening in the clouds above, sun starts to come through. And she's reinvigorated to get back to loving. And, that's what we have to remember, that to love like Christ, we need him. And so when we lean into him, which of course is what the Eucharist is all about, we have that love in our hearts. And then that love can pour out of our hearts to others on the streets. There's a little scene in Missionary Wall Street, my first book, of these two missionaries. I'm never named in the book. I'm just called a missionary.
mm-hmm,
So this missionary and his friend Bob are on the streets and they're asking people, hey, are you Catholic? And, most people are saying no, but some are saying, oh, yeah, and they're having a discussion and whatever. And a monk appears and, he's dressed in a Buddhist outfit. And the missionary is used to, I'm from New York. So, you got eyes behind your head. So I'm always kind of alert to what's going on. I'm thinking, okay, this is going to be an interesting exchange eventually. He's standing over on the side just watching us. And eventually there's sort of a break in the action, and he comes over and he says, listen, I'd like to introduce myself. I'm not Catholic. And I said, well, yeah, I kind of guessed you're not Catholic. And he says, well, I just got to say something to you guys. I've been standing here for 15 minutes watching you. And it's very apparent to me, and I think to everybody out on this street corner, that you love every one of these people that go by, even the ones that are putting cigars out in your forehead or jeering at you, but also the ones who stop and talk. There's a kind of love here that I've not seen on the streets of New York. You guys got to keep doing this.
oh,
And I do think that's our secret weapon, the love of Christ,
well, your book is called Visions of the Divine, an artistic journey into the mystery of the Eucharist. You're the author, with Evelyn Auth and Msgr Roger Landry, forward by Timothy Cardinal Dolan, published by Sophia Institute Press. Steve, been a remarkable conversation. I look forward to your next book. Any hints at what that might be? Have you planning another one?
You sound like you sound like Charlie McKinney, the president of Sophia. And my answer would be, Charlie, leave me alone, please. I'm exhausted here. I mean, there will be, I have several in my head, but I need a little time. Writing a book like this is so intense.
Yeah.
I find I have like writer's block for like a year. I just need to decompress a little bit. So, but yeah, there'll be more coming, John. And
Okay.
I'd love to have you out on the streets with us in New York. We're doing a
Yeah,
meeting
let's
in December.
let's let's do that. I would love that. Thank you, Steve.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, we're done.